Welcome to Mac Gamecast episode 10, a podcast where we talk about games, Mac games, and all sorts of fun adjacent things. I'm John Carr. With me today is Lily. How you doing, Lily?
Good. Glad to finally be back. I know I missed a few.
Woohoo! Yes, you are still responsible for our most popular podcast ever. Clearly a result of your attendance. And of course, the mighty Ted is also here today. How are you, sir?
Oh, doing well.
Fantastic. So today we have a very interesting subject we are going to talk about on this podcast, which is broadly speaking, a discussion around aspects of military wargaming, violence in the representation in the video game world, both on the serious side and maybe the more silly or arcadey side. And I think there's some very interesting points, thoughts, topics to be had. And Lily here is an active member of the military. Ted is a former member of the military, so I feel they have a very authentic and genuine point of view or opinion on this, more so than the average gamer, like myself, who's not a member of the military. So I thought that'd be really cool to talk about, and that's what we're going to do. So I would like to start with the more... you could almost say clickbaity side of it, though this is a podcast, so there's nothing to click on per se. But that being the, arcadeization, trivialization, quote unquote, of war in games. The easy target's Call of Duty. There's probably, other games that do this, though I can't think of them off the top of my head. But I know they have been there. A couple console ones come to mind. I think it was called Two Brothers or Two Buddies or something. I can't remember what it was. It was like these two mercenary soldier guys, and it was all like ultra violent and glorifying lots of killing, and mercenaries running around like killing dudes for money in war zones in third world countries. And and of course Call of Duty through, historically, seeing as, going back, I can't even remember when the first Call of Duty was released. They started with, I think, World War I or II, and then went up to like modern era, and then of course they've been jumping back and forth between basically like World War I or II and a bit of the future and a bit of the modern era, and they just, there's a big full range of the timeline here. But the multiplayer settings or the campaigns often take place in, basically either probably not ongoing, but former war zones, whether it's like Black Ops was set in Vietnam, so you had a whole campaign. Not the entire campaign, but levels of the campaign were set in Vietnam. That's a really serious war, and zillions of people died. But here you are in just arcade mode, so to speak, running around just gunning down people in Vietnam, and other popcorn spectacles going on with explosions and fire and rescues. And so it's like, okay, this is fun and it's entertaining, but the what I want to get to is like, should it be? Should these things be depicted in such a entertaining manner? Should it be treated with more seriousness or more quote unquote respect? Or do you guys think that's disrespectful? I don't know. I'm curious to hear what you think. What do you think about that, Lily?
Sure. So I wouldn't want to speak for every single person out there, but just personally, from my point of view, I'm not only a soldier, but I'm also a historian. And I've also, I've studied a fair bit of literature, and you look at the way wars have been depicted in the past, it's always kind of been there as a storytelling medium. Movies do it, books do it, and
Right.
Books do it going way back. You have poets and songs revolving around war.
Right.
And I think video games are no different in that respect, in a broad manner.
Right.
But then when you kind of narrow the focus and you look at a case-by-case basis, like arcadey types of war games, that's when it becomes a little more important to go like, okay, what's the context? So like, I'm going to juxtapose two extremes here.
Sure.
There is a Warhammer 40K game called, I think it's just called Space Marine.
Right.
And in that game, you spawn in and you're immediately just hewing your way through legions of orcs, and it's just bloody, and there's all of this spectacle, graphical overlays of ships slugging it out and artillery airstrikes, all that. But it's arcadey in a way that makes it clear that this is not real, this has never been real, and it probably never will be real. And that's, hopefully it will never be real.
Yeah.
But yeah, who am I to speak of what'll happen in the year 40,000? But anyways, that's a very much a different kind of game than I don't know, Call of Duty, where you're just it feels more real, and it's more of a near historical context. Like even World War II was just like not even 100 years ago; it was 80 years ago, give or take 3 or 4 years, depending on when you want to say it started. And I think again, when you're in that kind of situation, you have to widen the context even more. I think a good example for me, just looking within the Call of Duty games, Call of Duty 3 gave a mostly historical, and I say mostly because obviously it's not going to be 100% historical, and even some of the major events were kind of tweaked to fit the narrative. But it was very respectful. There was no glorification of anything outside of the context of the game. As in, there were some characters that were making the war, since you're playing as the Russians, it's a great patriotic war. But the game itself is not appealing to the player as this is a glorifying thing.
Right.
Whereas you look at the more recent iteration of Call of Duty in its World War II setting, Call of Duty World War II, and it's very ahistorical. There's a lot of and the musical score is very different, and I think even little things like that can be considered. Like it's very swooping and heroic, even though you're playing as the U.S. killing Germans, which is, of course, I would never speak against the killing of Nazis in World War II, but it makes the violence seem like it's glorious and heroic in a way.
Right.
And then the way the story missions progress with like the Germans just sort of rushing in en masse and just getting mowed down. And you get this sort of feeling of like, honestly, I tried to play Call of Duty World War II, but I couldn't make it through the campaign because I was like, this doesn't feel like it's done very tastefully. And so I think that's kind of my example there of tasteful versus non-tasteful. It's like, yeah, war is terrible. There's no way to justify that. But on one hand, you can be tasteful in its use as a storytelling metric and as a gameplay mechanic, or you could be needlessly glorifying it, or you could just make it so ridiculous that it doesn't really have a good link to the real world. So there are a few different ways game companies will tackle this, and I think that one stands out to me where it's like, okay, yeah, this is still just an arcade game. I'm pointing and clicking, but it no longer feels like this is done in a good manner.
Right. Yeah, that's I hear what you're saying, and I'm not personally advocating like none of these games should ever be made like Call of Duties and this and that, because like you said, the war is a setting, either a backdrop or direct setting in and around war zones has been, for a very long time used in all sorts of mediums, games, books, starting with more like, spoken songs, poems, written form, books, dramas, plays, whatever, all manner of things. And then of course, major, some of the best rated movies are war movies, whether it's things like Saving Private Ryan or Braveheart and this and that. One more medieval and a bit more modern example. So there's clearly a spectrum on display here, both in mediums outside games and within gaming. But of course, our discussion is primarily around gaming today. I think to me, of course, I don't know if we want to get into talking about like desensitizing to violence. Like, do you feel, as someone who is an active member of the military, you've been deployed, do you feel like this arcadey stuff desensitizes people or gives people the wrong impression of like how war really is? Like, I have respawns, I have save points, I have regenerating health. There's ammo piles every 10 feet or whatever, weird game things where there's just like random guns and ammo in places they never would be. Like, obviously, I'm not blaming anyone for making a game to be entertaining. I'm just curious, like, do you feel it really gives people the wrong impression, or are people sensible enough to discern like entertainment versus reality, or that's maybe too outside the scope of this podcast to discuss? I'm just like rambling here.
Ted, what do you think?
I was just laughing at John, but yeah, I have two thoughts on it. First of all, I look at most games as a form of, and almost like a form of an interactive movie. So in the case of one where it was done as a realistic semi-simulation of the real thing, it's almost like reading a good book or watching a good movie, and but in this one extra dimension where you're actually participating in it, which is kind of nice. That being said, I was concerned, and not for me because I was never in any face-to-face type of situation in my time in the service, but I was concerned about someone who might have been in, say, like Vietnam or something like that, who might have negative emotion associated with the events inside the game. And and I wonder if that takes a little bit away from uh, the importance of the fact that and that of what happened. But as far as that goes, I think living in that environment, and you can learn some strategy skills. You might learn some response skills, and I don't know how much the current military uses any form of gaming to train anybody. I know back when I was in, we did some form of stuff like that to put you in situations so that you could make split second decisions and then see the results of it in an environment where it wasn't going to mean your death. So and I see that as a good thing, but I think mostly I see the gaming environment that for the commercial gaming environment more of a form of entertainment and just another aspect of the movie, the book, the storyteller around the fire type thing that's been going on forever. And
Right.
I don't really see it as a really bad thing. I tend to personally shy away from military reenactment type games. I don't know why, um, but maybe there's something psychologically about it with me. But it doesn't mean I won't get into a shooter of some fashion. So I'm not sure why, but I always tended to shy away from those types. But other than that, I don't see any real problem with them as far as that goes. I think, again, I think it's just a form of entertainment. And I am a little bit concerned about the desensitizing aspect of it, though. And that's, you wonder. And one of the questions I have, and I don't know if Lily knows anything about this, but I'll pose the question. Years ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago, the U.S. Army had put out a game called America's Army.
Yeah.
Did that provide any useful input to the Army?
So America's Army was actually a recruitment tool, and
Right.
even today, like I know the U.S. Army esports team came under flack for trying to use video games to appeal to kids. It's just always kind of been there, and that's the job of recruiters, to
Yeah.
try and draw people into the army, and that's or just the military in general. That's always kind of going to be there. I know the Navy had a partnership with World of Warships at one point, which ironically the game owners are the game creators, developers are Russian, so that was a little bit of a funny link there. But it's my opinion on the whole desensitization thing. I think no reasonable, common thinking individual would equate a video game to real life. There's just too many divides. And I think going off of that, I don't think a reasonable individual would be affected by video games in that manner. Because it's very different. And I will say this, I've been playing shooters since I was a teen, since well before I had solid plans to join the army. I always kind of wanted to join the army, but I never really had that solid intention. And I can say for a fact that video games had no real effect on that. And going further off that, having seen actual combat and juxtaposing that with my experience in video games, I will tell you that there is nothing that can prepare you or desensitize you for that sort of environment. And the Army's actual training was built around preparing you for that, and it still is overwhelming. Every single soldier that has seen combat, soldier, Marine, sailor, whatever, will tell you that the first time is just jarring, and there is nothing that can prepare you for that. And as far as video games go, it's not even close.
Right.
Now, that being said,
yeah,
I know there are some arguments of this can spur people into a sort of single instance of violence. I know that video games and school shooters, for example, have been linked often. Not officially, but verbally, people will say, like, for example, with Columbine, the first really big case of it, people were saying that, because the kids were playing Doom, that might have had something to do with, I think it was Doom.
Yeah, it was Doom.
And then, but you've seen enough cases of this where it's like, no, the video games don't really have that effect on reasonable people. And, there's plenty of violence in our current entertainment medium. Like, we talk about, Vietnam style video games. Well, there are movies about Vietnam. There are books about Vietnam, fictional books about Vietnam, fictional movies about Vietnam. So it's, it's enough of a divide that I feel, and the science backs me up on this, that no, video games can't really desensitize you. And then, kind of backtracking a bit to a point Ted brought up, at least personally for me, whenever I see a game that takes place in Iraq, now this is just my personal feeling, I don't really relate that to the real Iraq. And, and it just goes back to video games can't really mimic that. There's no real way to, like, even in a VR game, which I have, I have a VR headset, I've played a VR game that, was quote unquote in Iraq, and it's like, you can't mimic the sights, the smell, the sound, the feel of all that gear and the heat. It's some people possibly could be affected by that, but I think most will not. And then there's that further point of game developers usually don't get it right, even on the visual aspects of it. Like,
I have a question. Maybe, sorry, this is a bit of an interject. As far as I understand, like, movies, Hollywood, whatever, aren't allowed to use, like, actual military army ranks and whatever. Is that also true in games? Or is that just wrong for movies?
No, that's a myth.
Okay, that's a myth.
It's usually just that Hollywood just gets it wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gets it wrong.
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
That was a common myth that started up after Hollywood got a bunch of uniforms and ranks wrong, and
Oh,
then they
okay.
just kind of rolled with it ever since as
I
their
see. I
fallback.
see. Right. It's like the excuse. Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, you were talking about basically the even if you're immersed in a game, it doesn't even come close basically to the reality of
Yeah.
this situation. Yeah.
Like, you can be the top ranked Warzone sniper, but if you pick up an actual Barrett 50 cal, you're not hitting shit. Like,
Right. There's no substitute for actual training, conditioning, experience, etc.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Even training is generally not enough compared to the real, quote unquote, real thing.
Right. It's a lot of people. Well, not a lot. Some people, from what I understand, when entering such situations, even with all the training in the world, can kind of have a breakdown or freeze up or be overwhelmed or whatever it is. All that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Linking back to what you were talking about, the school shootings. And we're not really getting into that, and that's all horrible things. But it's been, as far as I know, largely disproven or through studies in psychology and things like that there is no actual link there. I mean, I remember reading in a newspaper whenever that happened. Oh, and so whatever the names were. Oh, and they trained on Doom, and I actually burst out laughing because I was a gamer back then, and I know what Doom's like. I'm like, Doom? Are you kidding me? It's like the biggest disconnect from reality possible. Not to mention it was like basic 90s. There's no aiming. Everything auto aims for you. You're shooting like monsters from hell. There's health packs and secrets, and there's just like not even the vaguest link to reality, or even if you want to say reality, like actual training. Because you could argue, they went and played like a military sim game with like actual ballistics and physics and like weather and wind and stamina limitations. What you could say, like, okay, you could at least see the basis of an argument there, where there's a bunch of actual like attempted simulation, but like Doom, give me a break. It was like the biggest joke I've ever heard. So of course I'm prone to defend games. I'm a gamer. I have been a lifelong gamer, but I think basically why I wanted to bring this up, it's like I think the positive side, Lily was talking about the historical aspect. I think even though some of these things can be like arcadey or trivialized kind of basically for fun, it could also, at least depending on the person, prompt them to investigate that historical incident in more detail. I know it has prompted me more. I've gone and looked up things on Wikipedia or historical sites or whatever, like, oh, what actually happened here? What were the finer details? Or, or maybe what happened to this historical character you're either representing or the game is based around. I can't think of an example now, but Call of Duty's done this, at least with some of them, like we were talking about. And I've looked it up and I've been surprised or interested by some facts. Of course, we're talking largely like ground battles here. Of course, there's so many things. There's games about, Navy fighting. There's games with Air Force fighting, and whether modern or World War II and dog fighting and all this kind of stuff. And of course, there's broader strategy games. What's the game I always make fun of you for playing? Red Dragon. I always say Wed Dragon. What's that series?
Red Dragon War game.
Yeah, it's like broader, strategy and bigger armies and cover and terrain and buildings, and so there's like all kinds of games. And Ted was also saying, yeah, you could probably pick up some either critical thinking or maybe reflex type skills, response skills, or quote unquote training from these. And of course, some people may use that in all sorts of aspects of their life. But yeah, no one's going to, play war game and turn into like, the next military genius, or play Call of Duty and turn into the next, super sniper dude or lady. It's just not going to happen. And, yeah, but I like to, I'm also an optimist, so I like to think or hope that rather than just treating it all as pure fun, because I don't begrudge anyone having fun. I mean, we're gamers after all. But like, I would hope it would prompt them maybe to poke deeper at some of these subjects, these either historical or more modern day wars and events, whether they're America-based or foreign-based or whatever. I've learned a lot of interesting facts around like China and Japan and older wars and stuff. I can't think of them off the top of my head because I'm terrible with that. But playing various games and events and either getting prompted or poked or experiencing it, and then looking it up further, I'm like, oh, there's some really interesting stuff here. So, the medium can also broaden someone's experience or horizons or even thoughts. I think very few games are actually meant to do that. We've already discussed a lot about like Spec Ops: The Line on the show before, which is just, again, brilliant game. I think everyone should play it. Anyone who likes any sort of shooter or war game, 100% should play that game. And there's also This War of Mine, which is intentionally based on historical events of Eastern European wars and cities being bombed and actual stories of civilians trying to survive in this war-torn, active war zone city. And the game isn't actually meant to be fun. It's not really fun. It's an experience. I put like 40, 50 hours into it because I was so drawn in by the experience. And it was very compelling and often actually very like tough and kind of depressing and all these things. So I couldn't play it for like long periods of time because it wasn't meant to be a game so much as it was meant to be an experience and to get you thinking about it and bring some awareness to it and all this stuff like that. And the game won tons of awards and things like that. The developers went on to make Frostpunk, which is not a historical game or anything like that, but another very interesting game about experience and being put in tough situations, being forced to make really hard decisions around life and death. And, so there's lots of games that do interesting things, not even necessarily war related, but like the human condition or, what would happen to society or people under these conditions, So there's interesting things like that going on. But,
you mentioned This War of Mine, and if anyone has played it, and with me personally, I kind of did a little more digging about its historical basis, and it's actually very strongly based on the siege of Sarajevo, in Bosnia, which is the longest siege of a city of a urban city, in modern warfare, like longer than Stalingrad in World War II.
Wow.
And that in turn led me to do a little more research about the Bosnian War, which is a very unheard of, sort of forgotten war that really didn't happen too long ago. It was only in 1992 to 96, and NATO was a part of it. The US was a part of it. And a lot of people probably have never heard of it. There's also a very good book that I found on it after playing that game, called The Cellist of Sarajevo, which is loosely based on historical events. But yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of rambling now because this is all relevant.
This is the kind of like thoughts and opinions or facts I want to hear from you guys, like based around this discussion, like more than, because game, we're largely after fun for games, but I myself, and sometimes I'm after an experience. I don't just want to have pure fun. I want to like experience something, be immersed in something, in a story, a character, a setting, and like try and get a glimpse or idea of like what was this like, and those kinds of games can do that, at least to some extent. There's also games that are, totally, like Lily was talking about, the more extreme examples of, obviously clearly disconnected from reality. I'll use something like BioShock series, which I really like. Clearly very, it's set in our world, but it's I don't think anyone could really confuse that with reality, at least personally. It's very, very obviously something else. But the games tell some very interesting stories. And at least the first game, I think, is fairly subversive. Not necessarily the other second and third game, but they do some very interesting things with stories and characters and kind of like destiny and fate and choice and this and that. Nothing like, mind blowing or anything per se, although maybe some people would say that. But they're they are violent games. You have to kill a lot of people, although they're mostly like deranged drug addicts, kind of, to put it like in a very basic way. Because they've been shooting up this DNA-based stuff, Adam or whatever, too much, or Eve or whatever it is, and they've all gone crazy. So they're out to get you. And then it's like, a lot of games are like that. They basically put you in this situation where it's like, well, they're going to kill you, so you have to kill them, kind of a thing. In a very interesting, very oddball game, not Postal 1, but Postal 2. There's a Postal 3 and a Postal 4 is in early access right now. Postal 3 was made by some weird Russian studio, and everyone basically pretends the game doesn't exist. But Postal 2 is something I played way back in like the early 2000s. Actually, my brother bought it and sent me a copy. I was overseas, so I got it in the mail. But it's very interesting that, of course, most people, if you go watch a trailer, it's all just chaos and violence, and you're running around like kicking people's heads and peeing on them. And so the game is full of like total ludicrous stuff. But what it does that I find very interesting, there's also like a whole like jihadist network like hiding in your backyard, like in some tunnels in that game. So it's, it's totally ridiculous, but only if you play it that way. You don't have to play it that way. Most people probably do, but what the game actually does is just you go through a week in the life of the dude, and you just go out to the store to like buy some milk, or you go to the bank to cash a check, or you go to work to, I don't know, get fired or something, or resign. I forget what it is. You just basically go around doing mundane tasks, but as you go around doing these mundane tasks, which are the main quests essentially of the game, some ridiculous and frequently violent situation occurs around you, not because of you, but it like happens to you. So you can like stealth-ish, hide, run, flee. They give you, I believe, oh my goodness, I can't think of what it is. Not a cattle prod. Maybe it's a cattle prod. They give you basically something like zap people and stun them. Some sort of like electrical zappy stun weapon. I'm blanking on what they actually called it in the game right now. So you're not actually forced to kill anyone or anything if you don't want to. But of course, it's very easy to. There's guns everywhere, and you can grab things and shoot people's heads off and whatever. But you don't have to. And I think it's very thoughtful that you just walking around doing these mundane things in this town, and then all these ludicrously violent things occur around you, and then you can decide how to respond to them. A lot of people said the game was horribly distasteful and shouldn't have been made and all this kind of stuff, because they make fun of everyone in that game. No person, religion, gender, nothing's safe. Even the developers themselves, they actually like parody themselves in the game. So, it's kind of like this no limits humor game, and either some people appreciate that, some people don't. But in terms of a design standpoint and an experience standpoint, I thought it was very compelling that it did that. Because most games are either one or the other. You're like forced to fight, or it's like the stealth action game where you got to creep around and maybe you take down a guard or two, but you're mostly trying to avoid them and this and that and stuff like that. So this was interesting from a design standpoint, and I actually thought rather thoughtful. Although I doubt anyone would say Postal is thoughtful, mostly because it has a lot of like negative associations with the game, and probably rightfully so, because there's a lot of like absurd things you can engage in the games. But yeah. Interesting stuff. Ted, is there any any sort of you mentioned you tended to avoid those sort of historical event games, so maybe you prefer those more.
I like the more science fiction-y, fantasy type things. Just a personal opinion. I don't know where even it comes from. I mean, it's not like I haven't played some games like like last week we were talking about playing Metro and Metro Exodus, and that's kind of dealing with more realistic people inside the game. Although you like you mentioned in that game, you have the opportunity at some point to just say, okay, we give up, and then you don't have to. But for the most part, I tend to go towards the more science fiction-y, fantasy, this really never could happen type of thing. But then that goes along with the stuff I like to read, which is I like to read fantasy and science fiction. So maybe I'm just more comfortable in them, and someone who is more comfortable with history and historical military things would find the other games more appealing to their way of thinking. So, like I said, it's just a personal thing on my part, but
yeah, that makes sense.
It's not a moral thing.
Right, of course.
No, that makes sense. Everyone has their own uh, preferences. You know,
Right. So,
Yeah, I mean, I mean, some of my favorite games are those like sci-fi stuff, like we've been talking about. I mean, Lily and I are like huge Mass Effect fans, or Crack Effect. Ha ha ha. You
Yep.
know, I'm a big, we're both big fans of Warhammer as well. A lot of like Warhammer 40K games. Metro series, really cool. I don't know if you'd call that sci-fi, but I mean, it's post-apocalyptic. There is
yeah, it's
mutants.
post-apocalyptic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like hints of sci-fi, I guess.
Oh, there's
Stuff
a
like
lot of
that.
there's
Or you,
mutants and
yeah, or a little more sci-fi is the Stalker series. They're making a Stalker 2, so it's kind of coming back around in the gaming like consciousness. But Stalker, what is it? Shadow of Chernobyl, Stalker Clear Sky, and Call of Pripyat. They were all based on. Well, they were based on this. I think the idea of a book called a Roadside Picnic, if I'm not mistaken. Some old book which I did read, very oddball book. But basically, the Chernobyl disaster happened. 1986 happened to be the year I was born. Of course, I wasn't aware of anything about it till much later and read about it in school. But these series of games are set in the zone, this kind of like mysterious place that popped up around in and after the Chernobyl disaster happened, and there's mysterious, weird anomalies in there, and mutants and treasures. So all these like basically I don't want to call them necessarily mercenaries, but like treasure seekers, mercenaries, all manner of people, and they call them stalkers, which is really short, like for, I forget what it was, because it's STALKER, but all dot dot dot. It's an acronym. I forget what it stands for at this point. So there's all manner of people in the zone, vying for control and these weird anomalies, which you can hunt down and capture and sell. And so it's a little more like mystical almost in that game because there's all this kind of unexplained phenomena. But the reason I'm bringing them up is because I was a huge fan of those games and the immersion. And especially games later in the games, you do go to Pripyat, and it's all ruined. And the developers, I did some digging, and the developers actually went to Pripyat and took photos and did research and tried to capture, the sense of like what it might like to be there. It's very desolate and lonely, and like ruined civilization, deserted, all this stuff. Of course, you can't capture like Lily was talking about in terms of like really capturing an experience. Like, could you really capture the magnitude of maybe what it's like to be there or think about what happened? Probably not, but the game does a pretty good job of representing it, at least in my opinion. I've never been to Pripyat, but I thought it was solid in terms of capturing this like haunting, deserted like landscape basically. And the iconic Ferris wheel is there and all this stuff. But like Lily was talking about, with this war of mine caused her to dig and maybe read into books and stuff. It caused me to really dig into the Chernobyl incident and what happened and what went wrong and why and how the effects of it. And it was actually way more horrific than I ever imagined in terms of the destruction it caused in and around Chernobyl, and even all over the world. It blew this massive radiation cloud like halfway around the world and all sorts of horrible stuff. And I forget the exact name of the book. It might be called Shadows of Chernobyl or Long Shadow or Stories of Chernobyl, something like that. I forget the exact name. I got it from the library. And it's all these real life accounts of people and what happened at the time. It's all like little. Thank you.
Whispers.
Yeah.
Okay.
And really, really compelling, but really intense read, in and around this whole event. And this was all spurred by me just playing a game, which was initially for fun. And then it led me to this like really deep like dive into this historic event. So it's not a war game, but it is, the Stalker games are, they're very fighty and shooty. You do tend to kill a lot of people and get gear and loot and,
not whispers, voices. I will correct myself.
Okay. Voices.
Voices from Chernobyl.
Yeah. Right. So it's like kind of, it's like war adjacent kind of. There are factions fighting in the games technically, but there's no like enormous battles, but there are small scale.
But it kind of goes with the topic though, in the sense that, what you're talking about is it's a simulation of a almost reality in a sense. This event really happened, and they're using the environment of the event that happened to create a fantasy or science fiction, if you want, environment for the game, which is interesting. And again, that's the part of the gaming that I really like, which, pulling stuff from the universe and creating visuals of what what it might possibly look like. And that's probably one of the only reasons I like a movie based on a book, is because it's interesting to see how the movie person or the producer, the developers would envision the environment of this fantasy story or the science fiction story. And inside of a game, to actually be able to go inside of it, look around at things. I mean, that's one of my favorite parts of any game that I've ever played.
Nice.
I have a funny story. I was playing Unreal Tournament years ago,
Mm.
and I'm playing with a friend of mine, and we're doing one-on-one shooting at each other. He's a lot younger than I was, and a lot better at it than I was. But anyhow, so we're running around this cityscape, and I'm running through, to kind of keep away from him, who's, basically killing me every time I stand in one place too long. And all of a sudden, I see this poster on a billboard, and it's for a restaurant that's in a town like pretty close to where I live. And with the name of the restaurant and a phone number and the whole 10 yards, and it's like, what? Boom. But well, long story short, it turns out one of the developers was actually raised in the town and took some pictures in that area and incorporated
Oh,
them into the game. So it was just I found out completely serendipity, but it was a long story. But anyhow, I thought that was kind of cool. But the whole point is, people pulling information from the real environment, creating a fake or fantasy environment, and letting you be able to go in it and experience it, look around, go through doors, crawl through crawl spaces. I mean, to me, that's like, wow, that's neat. And that's kind of what it goes along with the military stuff, in the sense that you're creating a game based on a historical event. Well, maybe loosely, maybe not so loosely, but
mm.
you could actually experience some aspect of that, and you might find it interesting. Like I said, I tend to shy away from the reality ones and more for the fantasy science fiction type. But in the same thing, I think there's a lot of value to the games in that, and that's one of the things that really attracts me to it.
Nice. Yeah, no, at the end of the day, I think it's very positive, and I think gaming itself is generally positive. I mean, people, yeah, I'm talking about the games themselves, not necessarily the people who play them. Like online bullying or toxicity in certain games anyway are like, problematic. But we're not here to deep dive that or anything. But, I think games can be a great exploration or experience of something, a good way to unwind. And kind of going back to this historical idea of like, I don't want to deep dive this, but I want to wrap up with this thought or this like idea of like, I guess are humans like inherently just really violent creatures? It would seem to be true. So is it like, are like action or games with violence in them a great way to like safely channel human aggression? I don't know. Maybe it is. I'm talking about reasonable people here, not like unhinged people who, go out and do horrible acts of violence in the real world. Um, I don't know. It's an interesting thought. I don't know how true that would be, but it's like, it just seems throughout history, humans have a history of violence. Some of it maybe justified or quote unquote correct, and maybe a bunch of it not so much. So I don't want to deep dive that idea, but just like poke at it. Do you guys have any
I always
comments about
thought
that?
that myself, John, as far as that goes, that, to to put in, put the violence, the action, that type of stuff inside of a game puts a person who might be inclined to do something in a situation where they can kind of burn that out of their system in a sense or whatever, and do it in an environment where they're not hurting anything, real, as opposed to going out and trying to be cruel to somebody for real. I've always felt that it was a way to, pull people away from that. And I could be wrong. I don't have any degrees in studying, psychology or anything, but I always thought that was the case. So that's my opinion.
Nice.
I'd
Lily, any
be
comments?
I might be more of a optimist, maybe still, despite all the things that I've seen and done. But I don't think humans are inherently violent. I think individual people can be violent,
Mm,
but I think there's no real difference in terms of video games as a metric of violence than any other medium. You look at movies, there are plenty of movies that are filled with violence. You look at sports, there are plenty of sports that are built around violence. And
right.
not everyone's about that. And I think humans are a very diverse people. And at the end of the day, being violent in a video game, scientifically, it doesn't give you the same reaction as being violent in real life. And even on a physical level, there's there's a big difference between shooting or hitting someone in a video game and doing it in real life. And people can be mean in video games and they can be mean in real life.
Mm,
It's not cut and dry as saying, uh, you know, video games are successful when they're violent because humans are naturally violent. Like,
right.
if you watch some videos of FIFA uh, players and they're just, cursing and raging at each other and saying these like horrible things, and it's like, that's not even a game about violence. But people will
Right.
still completely be at each other's throats. And then on the other hand, you can watch a game of like Overwatch with, a functional team and people are kind and respectful and yeah, that's rare most of the time. In Overwatch, people will be like raging at each other, but that can happen anywhere, and that's kind of, I think, fitting into my point that humans aren't cut and dry. There's no black and white.
Yeah.
It's
No.
as
Yeah.
with all things, it's a mixed bag. It's a spectrum, and
Right.
some
Right.
people
No,
are
I agree with
complete
that.
assholes,
And
and some people are not.
yeah, I think the main thrust of your, not argument, but your points here, and I agree with, is that like these things aren't exclusive to games. They've happened well before games came along, and they continue to happen outside of games and all sorts of interactions and events in life as well. So it's more about the individual, and that makes a lot of sense. I wasn't trying to like blanket, make blanket statements about humanity as a whole. It was more like a wondering thought.
Yeah.
Um, and I would agree with that. It's true. Some of the most like pleasant and chill moments I've had in games are games that are violent, whether it's a MOBA like Dota or certain Call of Duty games. And you just coincidentally get this group of people. They're all chill. They all communicate really nicely. Everyone's like super positive as you run around like killing other virtual people. And everyone's like cheerful and chill. And sometimes you friend them after or whatever. Or maybe you never see them again. But yeah, it could be just because I play a lot of those games in general, and I don't necessarily run around playing other cooperative games that are maybe less violent, or less conflict driven. But practically all games, even like Monopoly's conflict driven, or Clue or whatever. Like humans, it might be fairly true to say that we thrive on, if not conflict, at least competition. That's probably fair to say. A lot of people do.
Yeah.
Competition,
Um,
absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say as a not 100%, but fairly wide-ranging net for humanity. Yeah, so that's interesting. But that's it. At the end of the day, yeah, games provide all kinds of experiences. Um, and there's very few truly like horrible, distasteful games. And if they really are, they tend to be like banned or not allowed on platforms like Steam and Epic and whatever. For the most part, anyway, not entirely, but relatively. Yeah, but that's our thoughts on violence in games, mostly related to war and military in general, because of these two fine people, and Lily and Ted, active and former members of the military. How about wrap it up with anything we've been playing lately? Lily, I know you've been really busy, but have you had any time to play any games lately?
I've been sneaking in wherever I can a bit of Crusader Kings 3,
Oh,
and then
nice.
Oh,
I got Surviving Mars for free because of that. I think it was Paradox's like anniversary of their founding or something, so they gave that away for free. And pretty neat game. It's a little slow, but it's pretty neat. So I guess I've been playing some Paradox games as of late. But yeah,
Well,
I came right out of the field, and now I'm getting ready to move, and then I'm deploying shortly after. So not a lot of time for games.
Right. I feel like the historian in you would really enjoy the Crusader Kings 3 sort of thing, like creating legacies and histories of like rulers and battles and all this kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I especially love stomping on the patriarchy like 800 years early. That's my favorite part of things. Like I made my own offshoot of a religion just so I could have a queen, and then I just started curb stomping my way around Ireland and England. And then I took over France because it was annoying me.
I should. Yeah,
That's fun.
Yeah, that is great. That's wonderful. I enjoyed those little anecdotes. Ted, what's been on your gamer?
I'm still working my way through Metro Exodus, so that's.
Is it nice? Is it still holding up for you? Like still having a great time?
Oh yeah, still having a good time with it. Yeah, I'm really enjoying the multiple environments that you go through, and again, goes back to what I was saying. It's just fun to be able to meander about this environment. And yeah, sure, there's things that get in your way, but they did a really good job of creating the environments and the things in the environments and the hazards that you have to go around and whatnot. And yeah, I really find it really nice. It's just sometimes I wish I had a bigger monitor. My 27-inch iMac is just a little. But
I really need to play that game. I'm still on Last Flight, but I've just never gotten around to finishing it.
Oh, honestly, if at this point I would, and I've done this with some basically games over time, is I would just go and like read the plot of Last Light or watch some YouTube videos and then just go play Exodus. Like,
yeah, Exodus I think was better than Last Light. Yeah,
it's also there was a huge,
more polished.
It was a pretty big time gap between like Last Light and Exodus. What to speak of 2033 and Exodus. In 2033 and Last Light are very similar overall. And Exodus is a huge leap, not just visually, but even like mechanically and the story experience and the gameplay experience. Basically, everything is like vastly superior to anything you'll find in Last Light. Personally, in terms of
but if I don't finish Last Light, then I have the excuse of saying, oh yes, I'll get to Exodus when I finish Last Light, and then I never get around to finishing Last Light, so I don't feel guilty. But I also feel guilty because I'm not playing Last Light, and then I can't play Exodus.
Oh no, it's a catch-22.
Yes, I've caught myself in this trap, and now I will sit here.
Speaking of catch-22, that is a absurd war adventure novel. I don't even know what to call it, but
hilarious.
Yeah.
And it's, I hate to say it, but sometimes it just nails the army spot on.
It nails the Navy on too.
My favorite part, just to talk about the book really quick, is I think it's the doctor who he's supposed to log airtime. So he doesn't actually go in the airplane, but the pilot writes down that he did, but then the pilot crashes and dies. So he's actually dead. He's listed as dead. But obviously he's alive, but people are like, well, it says here you died. So then he gets ejected. He loses his doctor job or whatever, and two other guys take it over. And then he just kind of wanders around this morose guy because everyone won't really deal with him because he's supposed to be dead because of the paperwork.
Because of the paperwork, yeah. Oh yeah.
No, that would happen in the army. Believe me, it would happen.
Good times. And to wrap up, I've been playing and finishing Desperados 3. The stealth action adventure. Well, I was going to say World War III, Wild West series. Really, really fun. If you enjoy basically stealth combat puzzles and a Wild West setting, it's a great game with some really interesting characters and story and really good production values, good graphics, really strong voice acting and audio, and it also has really awesome optimization on Mac. Intel or Silicon Macs and all that, so kind of not anything can run it, but a lot of machines can run it. So yeah, it's a game from last year. I think it's a lot of fun. Desperados 3, have a peek if sounds appealing. And that will do us for this momentous and occasion-ish, I'm making up words, podcast episode 10, getting in the double digits now, woohoo. So many thanks, Lily, for taking the time to come on and lending your unique perspective. Loved it. Same for Ted. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Happy to be here.
Yeah, me too. Glad to be here.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time. A big thank you to Kevin McLeod for the intro and outro music. Be sure to check out his library on the web. You can find more episodes of our show on our website, macgamecast.com, or in all major podcast directories. If you enjoy the show, please consider commenting, following, or sharing. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.